Hello, everyone. My name is Kelli Roemer. I'm a PhD student at Montana State University. Today, I'm excited to share the first chapter of my dissertation research titled Coal Communities in the U.S. Energy Transition, a Policy Corridors Assessment, co-authored with my advisor, Dr. Julia Haggerty. The United States is undergoing a major energy transition, characterized by the widespread retirement of its aging coal-fired power plants, reduced use of operating coal plants, and the decline in thermal exports. This graph here illustrates the buildup and retirement of coal-fired generation capacity in megawatts since the 1940s. The green bars show coal-fired capacity in megawatts built. As you can see, the majority of it built between the 1960s and 1980s. The gray bars show retired capacity, and the blue bars show capacity scheduled for retirement. This transition is driven primarily by market forces, such as increased competition from natural gas, renewable sources, and stagnant demand for electricity. The effects of COVID-19 global pandemic is compounding declines in coal electricity generation and production, and the Energy Information Administration is forecasting the accelerated closure of timelines of U.S. coal facilities. For coal-dependent communities, states, and regions, the energy transition brings a set of social, economic, and environmental impacts that vary by geography. In the American West, remote, isolated communities are more vulnerable to the social and economic impacts of closure compared to their metro and connected counterparts. There is a need to plan for the loss of employment and tax revenue, as well as ensure that adequate decommissioning and environmental remediation happens. However, recent research shows that transition in coal communities is limited, and communities in their plans are not implementing strategies recommended in the literature. Stepping back at a larger scale, to meet global climate objectives, several developed economies across the world have implemented coal phase-out initiatives. In contrast, the United States does not have a national set of policies designed to facilitate the energy transition. Rather, policymaking in the United States is highly decentralized, with individual states introducing their own sets of policies on energy production, consumption, as well as mitigating the socioeconomic implications of transition. Thus, the current policy landscape addressing community-level impacts of the coal transition is complex and disjointed and presents a need for critical assessment of existing policies and how they align or misalign with the needs of impacted communities. This paper addresses this need by reviewing federal and state policies that address the socioeconomic impacts of the coal transition in rural communities in the Western United States, examining how exogenous forces such as policy influence options for isolated communities as they navigate the multifaceted coal transition, provides an opportunity to increase insight and understanding of how macro-scalar policies shape the direction and pace of complex community transitions in resource regions. To do so, this paper draws on and seeks to contribute to broader geographic scholarship examining resource dependent and socioeconomic transitions in resource peripheries. Additionally, in an age of widespread economic and environmental uncertainty, especially in political economic contexts characterized by devolved governance, the concept of community resilience has become increasingly important. Here, community resilience describes the ability of a social system to mobilize its resources and work together in response to a shock. In this case, the shock is the loss of a major industry, a coal plant or mine. This figure highlights key features of community resilience, where these strengths combine to influence a community's adaptive capacity. Particularly for remote, isolated coal communities, research has stressed the importance of proactive planning before the decline, support in mitigating fiscal impacts, and long-term financial and technical assistance in supporting capacity and the ability to self-organize and exercise agency. Finally, this research also applies Jeff Wilson's transition theory, and in particular, the concept of policy corridors, which describes the policies exogenous to communities that set the parameters for community actions. Policies here are understood as a set of formal rules and regulations largely associated with the state. Community level responses to shocks and disruptions are shaped by these forces, by these outside macro level economic, political, and environmental processes upon which communities have little influence, but they can severely constrain decision-making and action at the local level. Scholars emphasize the role of policy is particularly important in defining and shaping the direction and pace of transitional corridors. Therefore, it is essential to examine how the complex and disjointed policy landscape in which the coal transition is taking place enables or constrains resilient community pathways. This study applies this conceptual framework and a mixed methods approach to investigate the policy corridor shaping coal community transitions in resource peripheries. To establish the existing policy corridor or corridors, this study examines 3 sets of national and state level policies that affect the coal transition, including U.S. energy policy, state legislation addressing the decline of the coal industry, and federal transition assistance programs. Also, 20 semi-structured interviews with transition policy experts, economic development practitioners, and community planners were conducted to capture expert insights about the implications of the policy corridor for transitioning coal communities. This review began with a look back at U.S. energy policy since 1975, when, after the 1973 oil embargo, there was a major push for energy independence through the development of the West coal resources. The EPCA, Energy Policy Conservation Act, sought to increase energy production and supply and provided incentives by guaranteeing loans for producers. Another notable act was the EPA of 1992, which, among other things, reformed the Public Utility Regulating Act, or PURPA, allowing for private market competition within the wholesale generation of electricity, paving the way for energy deregulation. For 30 years after the EPCA, comprehensive national energy policy was enacted approximately every 5 to 10 years, with years of debate spanning in between. The most recent comprehensive energy legislation was enacted in 2005. Since then, energy policy has been enacted through executive action. The Obama administration's Clean Power Plan, signing of the Paris Agreement, and federal coal leasing moratorium. The challenge with making policy by executive order is that the next administration can easily change established policies. As we saw with the repeal of the Clean Power Plan, lifting of the federal coal leasing moratorium, and the U.S. making formal moves to exit the Paris Agreement. Key findings from this review indicate that past energy policies such as the EPCA, have created the core periphery dynamic and complicated ownership regime that thwarts transition efforts in remote coal communities. In addition, the absence of a coordinated policy designed to facilitate the energy transition has important implications for frontline communities. Key challenges facing coal communities include significant labor disruptions, loss of tax revenue to support public services, and limited opportunities to replace economic-based activity. The unstable and rapidly changing policies at the national level send conflicting messages exacerbating uncertainty about the future pace and direction of transition, when and how the rupture or shock will occur, and how it will affect specific communities. Without a comprehensive national policy framework to address the implications of the coal transition, several Western states have enacted their own legislation to address the impacts of the decline of the coal industry. We reviewed recent legislation in Arizona, Colorado, Montana, New Mexico, Washington, and Wyoming, which illustrated a range of strategies and support for transition. While no two states are the same, two distinct and diverging types of policy corridors emerge. The first type of corridor, outlined in or colored the darker purple, seeks to accelerate the transition away from coal-based electricity, as well as to clarify the pace of transition by setting closure dates or incentives to expedite coal plant retirements. The second type of corridor works to slow the energy system transition by bolstering the coal industry and aims to postpone coal plant retirements. For communities negotiating these policy corridors, the state approach to managing the transition has important implications for the socioeconomic transition experienced at the local level. First, policy corridors that accelerate the pace of transition provide certainty and a timeline that informs local transition strategies. For example, a policy expert familiar with the negotiations of the 2011 Washington Coal Transition Bill emphasized the importance of the extended timeline for preparing for workforce and labor impacts. According to the interviewee, an earlier version of the bill setting the closure dates for 2015 was opposed by labor stakeholders. More support was garnered by the 2020 and 2025 closure dates, which provided, quote, more time to plan and think about the redirection of their workforce, end quote. Longer timelines allow communities to engage in strategic approaches to addressing the differentiated impacts of labor changes. Second, despite state efforts to postpone coal decline as long as possible, as seen in recent policies enacted in Wyoming and Montana, communities are more exposed to unexpected closures and layoffs. Without access to a planned approach allowing for mitigating the impacts of revenue loss, local municipalities are driving towards a fiscal crisis. Finally, the last set of policies I reviewed were the transition assistance programs that emerged in 2015 during the Obama administration. They have shifted and been rebranded a bit in the current administration. These programs target resources to bolster existing economic development programs through grant funding and technical assistance. To qualify for these funds, you need to demonstrate economic distress due to changes in the coal industry. Discussions with interview participants highlight critical gaps between policy and the needs of remote, isolated, coal-reliant communities. Several experts and practitioners identified a central challenge to supporting community transitions is the lack of obvious development options available to replace the coal-based tax revenue, economic-based activity, and employment. An economic development practitioner who works for a regional development district describes how this reality affects community stakeholders' willingness to discuss the aspects of transition. They would sit in a room and start talking about transitioning economies, that there's not a direct replacement for that. I think that the backfill of revenue to support communities is the piece that we have not figured out well on any level. If we could figure that out, communities would be much more willing to transition, end quote. The absence of structures to address revenue loss was a concern mentioned by nearly every interviewee. In addition, interviewees expressed fear of the loss of critical services and institutions. This challenge presents an important gap between existing programs and what is needed in impacted communities. Previous studies examining economic transitions in resource-dependent counties emphasize the importance of economic diversification and planning before the decline occurs. In addition to proactive planning, transition strategies need to mitigate the immediate impacts and provide support for a long-term economic transition. Interviews demonstrate that timelines of federal transition assistance programs are incongruent with the needs of impacted communities. Federal and state resources for communities are not available until formal announcements of closure or demonstrated layoffs. Instead, these resources operate as emergency assistance, and practitioners are concerned that by the time communities are able to access these critical resources, it may be too late to alter resilience pathways. Economic and community development practitioners also emphasize that projects linked to long-term solutions take time. It's important to understand that, quote, "You're not going to come in with a 3-year grant and save the community," end quote. As many of these grants operate on short-term funding cycles, practitioners are asking for support that can be linked to long-term economic development goals. Finally, policy experts are calling for larger investments and greater external support for impacted communities and workers than the existing programs like the ACC provide. A tax policy expert with a national public policy research firm assessed that federal intervention is key and that impacted communities and regions may need long-term reinvestment, quote, "orders of magnitude higher than existing grants or loans. It will be on the order of billions per year for 10 years. I wouldn't do it forever. I mean, it is a transition, but I do think 10 years might be about the right length," end quote. As the pace of the energy transition accelerates, it is important to consider how federal and state policy have shaped the existing transition landscape and how to provide meaningful opportunities and tangible resources that support communities navigating the social and economic impacts of transition. Findings indicate that past energy policies have created the core periphery dynamic and complicated ownership regime, challenging transition efforts in remote coal communities. The absence of a national energy policy exacerbates uncertainty for coal communities, and it leaves it to states to establish their own legislation, resulting in a range of strategies and levels of support. 2 distinct policy corridors are emerge among states reviewed in this paper. The first corridor accelerates the energy transition and seeks to clarify the pace of transition by negotiating closure dates or incentives to expedite coal plant retirements. The second corridor works to slow the transition by bolstering the coal industry and aims to postpone coal plant retirements. While it is too soon to know how community pathways will be shaped by these policy corridors, both the literature and expert interviews agree that strategies that provide more certainty around closure dates, provide time and resources for early planning, and secure transition funds better equip communities to navigate change and transition. Findings from the policy analysis and interviews with experts and practitioners highlight several opportunities to improve policy to address the coal transition. At the federal level, there's a need for comprehensive legislation that coordinates the energy transition by establishing clear timelines and strategies for transition, mandates a comprehensive assessment of impacts of closure, and identifies strategies to mitigate social, economic, and environmental impacts. In coordination with energy transition policy, federal assistance programs for coal communities need to be significantly expanded in terms of scope and scale. Policy experts are calling for long-term predictable funding for assistance programs and significant reinvestment in impacted communities and regions. More flexibility is needed in how grant programs can be used to better meet the needs of vulnerable communities. With that, I will conclude. Thank you for listening. I am looking forward to our scheduled discussion. This work has been supported by the National Science Foundation and will continue to be supported by the USDA NEFA program. Thank you so much.